In the summer of 1970, a young Egyptian aristocrat walked up to the gates of the Israeli embassy in London and asked to speak to someone from Israeli intelligence. He was not drunk. He was not desperate for money in any way that showed on the surface. He was, by marriage, family to Gamal Abdel Nasser, the most powerful man in the Arab world. Within days, he would become the most valuable spy Israel had ever recruited in the Middle East. Or, depending on who you believe, he would become the most dangerous piece of deception the region has ever produced. More than 50 years later, historians, generals, and the very spy chiefs who ran him still cannot agree on which of those two men he actually was. This is the story of Ashraf Marwan, the man Mossad called the Angel, and the man Egypt would one day bury as a hero.
To understand Ashraf Marwan, you first have to understand the wound that shaped Egypt in the years before him. In June of 1967, Israel humiliated the entire Arab world in 6 days. Egypt lost the Sinai Peninsula. Its air force, the pride of the Arab world, was destroyed on the ground before a single squadron ever left the runway. 15,000 Egyptian soldiers were killed or captured in the desert, many of them abandoned without water in the retreat back across Sinai. Gamal Abdel Nasser, the man who had promised his people dignity and Arab unity, was forced onto television to admit total defeat. He offered to resign. The streets of Cairo refused to let him go. But behind the closed doors of Egyptian intelligence, something had cracked that would never fully heal. A paranoia about penetration, about spies, about who inside the government could truly be trusted. It is inside that atmosphere of suspicion and humiliation that a young man named Ashraf Marwan began to build his path to power. Ashraf Marwan was born in 1944, the son of an Egyptian army officer, a respectable family, but not a powerful one. He studied chemistry at Cairo University, and by nearly every account from people who knew him, he was clever, effortlessly charming, and hungry for a life far larger than the one he had been born into. In 1965, he met Mona Nasser, the daughter of the President of Egypt. A year later, against Nasser's own explicit wishes, Marwan married her. Nasser reportedly distrusted his new son-in-law from the very beginning. He saw in Marwan a young man in love with money, status, and the company of powerful people, not a man in love with Egypt or its revolution. Nasser once reportedly tried to have his own daughter's marriage annulled. He reportedly disapproved so strongly that he had Marwan investigated, and for a time even had him barred from certain sensitive government functions. But Marwan was patient. He waited Nasser out, cultivated relationships with other officials in the meantime, and slowly worked his way back into the family's good graces. History would eventually prove that Nasser's instincts were not wrong. He simply never lived to see exactly how right he had been. Marriage into the first family of Egypt opened doors that money alone could never buy.
Marwan was given a position inside the presidential office, close to the center of Egyptian power, at one of the most sensitive moments in the country's modern history. When Nasser died suddenly of a heart attack in 1970, his successor, Anwar Sadat, chose to keep Marwan close rather than push him out, eventually elevating him to one of his most trusted personal advisors, with direct access to Egypt's most sensitive military and diplomatic secrets. Marwan sat in rooms where war plans were discussed in whispers. He read cables that most cabinet ministers were never shown. He carried messages between Cairo and foreign capitals on matters far above his official rank. He was, in every practical sense, inside the room where Egypt's future was being decided in real time. And it was precisely that access
that made him one of the most dangerous men in the entire Middle East. Because in 1970, for reasons that are still argued over today, he offered to sell every bit of it to Israel.
By the early 1970s, President Sadat was walking a careful line that few outsiders fully understood at the time. Publicly, he spoke of peace and diplomacy. Privately, he was quietly rebuilding Egypt's shattered military, training a new generation of engineers to cross the Suez Canal under fire, and preparing contingency plans for a war he hoped would restore Arab pride, even if it could not fully reclaim the Sinai by force alone. It was this exact contradiction, a leader speaking peace in public while planning war in private, that made a source like Marwan so extraordinarily valuable. He was not just reporting weapons counts. He was reporting the true intentions behind Sadat's public statements, the gap between what Egypt said and what Egypt actually meant to do. That gap would prove decisive in the years that followed. Why would the son-in-law of Egypt's revolutionary president walk into an enemy embassy and volunteer to become a spy? The official explanation, the one Marwan gave himself more than once, was simple: money. He had expensive tastes, mounting personal debts, and a hunger for a lifestyle his government salary could never fund on its own. Mossad's officers in London were suspicious from the very first meeting. An offer this good, from a source this close to the throne of power, felt to seasoned intelligence men like it might be a trap. An Egyptian plant sent to feed Israel carefully engineered false information. So they tested him, carefully and repeatedly. They asked questions they already knew the answers to, from other sources, and waited to see if he would lie or exaggerate. Marwan answered every one correctly, and, notably, never once tried to inflate his own importance or invent secrets he didn't actually have. Slowly, cautiously, over months of verification, Mossad decided to believe him. They gave him a code name that would follow him for the rest of his life, and long after his death: the Angel. For the next several years, Marwan became what intelligence professionals call a golden source, an agent so well placed inside enemy leadership that his information didn't need to be cross-checked against other sources, because it was already better than what most nations receive from their own generals. He reported in detail on the flow of Soviet weapons pouring into Egypt after the humiliation of 1967. He described, component by component, the capabilities of Egypt's new Soviet-supplied surface-to-air missile network, a network that would later prove devastating to Israeli fighter jets in the opening days of the next war. He passed along verbatim minutes from closed-door meetings between President Sadat and senior Soviet officials, information no outside power should ever have been able to obtain. For the analysts receiving his reports in Tel Aviv, it felt like an intelligence windfall that simply never stopped arriving. Some senior officers began to argue, quietly, that Marwan alone was worth more than the rest of Mossad's entire human intelligence network in the Arab world combined. But every golden source comes attached to a golden question that professional spies never quite let themselves forget. What if you are not buying secrets from a man? What if a government is selling you a story through him? It is worth pausing here to understand just how rare a source like this truly is in the history of espionage. Israel had run other legendary agents in the Arab world before Marwan, men like Eli Cohen, who infiltrated Syria's military establishment so completely that he was nearly appointed Deputy Minister of Defense before his capture and execution in 1965. But Cohen operated as an outsider who built his access from nothing. Marwan was different. He didn't need to build access. He was born into it by marriage, handed the keys to the palace, and he chose on his own to hand a copy of those keys to the enemy. That distinction, access earned through years of careful deception,
versus access simply inherited and then sold, is part of why intelligence historians still argue about which man deserves to be called the greater spy.
Inside Mossad, not everyone was convinced that their golden source was exactly what he appeared to be. A small, stubborn faction of analysts argued that no one this close to an Arab head of state would realistically be allowed to leak this much, this consistently, without his own government eventually noticing, or worse, without his own government secretly permitting it. They pointed to something quietly unsettling buried in years of reporting. The intelligence Marwan handed over was almost always genuine and almost always useful. But it also always seemed to arrive with suspicious smoothness, almost on schedule, as if it were being released rather than stolen. Was it possible that Egypt was running its own long game, deliberately using its own son-in-law as bait, feeding Israel just enough real intelligence over years to manufacture total, unquestioning trust? For a long time, that uncomfortable question stayed buried beneath the sheer usefulness of what Marwan provided. Israel was winning too much, too consistently, to stop and ask why the game felt this easy. That confidence, and that unresolved question, would both be tested in October of 1973, in the most consequential 72 hours of Ashraf Marwan's entire double life. By the autumn of 1973, Egypt and Syria were quietly preparing for a war that Israeli intelligence had convinced itself was not coming. Israeli military planners had built their entire defensive strategy around something internally called the concept, a working theory that Egypt would never dare launch a full-scale attack until it possessed aircraft capable of striking deep into Israeli territory, weapons that Cairo, according to Israeli analysts, did not yet have. It was a comfortable assumption. It let commanders sleep at night. It was also completely wrong. On October the 5th, 1973, Ashraf Marwan requested an emergency face-to-face meeting with his Mossad handler in Europe, a level of urgency he had never used before. He told them in language far more direct than usual, war was coming. Both Egypt and Syria intended to attack, and soon, on two fronts at once. In the early hours of October the 6th, Yom Kippur, the holiest day on the Jewish calendar, Marwan delivered his final and most urgent warning yet. War, he told his handler, would begin that same evening at sunset. Israeli intelligence scrambled immediately. Reservists were hurriedly called up across the country. The Prime Minister and her most senior defense chiefs met in emergency session and debated launching a preemptive strike against the massing Egyptian and Syrian forces, ultimately deciding against it for political reasons. They trusted Marwan's warning enough to begin partial mobilization of the reserves, but not enough to fully prepare their forward positions in time. Because the attack did not come at sunset, as Marwan had told them. It came at 2 o'clock that afternoon, a full 8 hours earlier than his warning. Egyptian forces stormed across the Suez Canal in overwhelming numbers. Syrian tanks poured into the Golan Heights almost simultaneously. Israel was caught only half ready, and in the brutal opening days of the war that followed, it very nearly paid for that 8-hour gap with catastrophic, irreversible losses. That 8-hour gap between Marwan's warning and the reality on the ground became the single most debated detail in the entire history of Israeli intelligence, and it remains fiercely debated today. Was it an honest mistake? Marwan simply repeating the timing he himself had been told by Egyptian planners, unaware that Cairo had quietly moved the attack forward at the very last minute? Or was it something far colder and more calculated? A deliberate lie, timed with surgical precision, designed to make Israeli commanders believe they had a full evening to prepare so that they would hold back their most urgent defensive measures
just long enough for Egypt to achieve total tactical surprise. To this day, the Israeli officers who worked directly with Marwan remain sharply split on the answer. Some insist, without hesitation, that he saved thousands of Israeli lives by giving any warning at all, however imperfect. Others believe that those 8 hours were the single most expensive lie in the entire history of the Arab-Israeli conflict. A lie that cost Israel dearly in the war's opening days, before its forces eventually turned the tide.
Despite the brutal opening days, Israel eventually absorbed the shock, mobilized its full reserve force, and mounted a ferocious counteroffensive on both fronts. Within 3 weeks, Israeli armored columns had crossed to the western bank of the Suez Canal and encircled an entire Egyptian army, while Israeli forces on the Golan Heights had pushed Syrian troops back well beyond the pre-war lines. The war that began as Israel's greatest intelligence failure ended, militarily, as an Israeli battlefield victory, but a victory bought at a devastating cost in lives, and one that permanently shattered Israel's sense of intelligence invincibility. And through it all, the question of Ashraf Marwan's true loyalty sat quietly in the background, unresolved, waiting decades for anyone to ask it out loud. Whatever the full truth of that 8-hour gap, Marwan's usefulness to Israeli intelligence did not end with the war, and neither did his own personal ambitions. He continued quietly feeding information for years afterward, even as he simultaneously built a second, very public life as a wealthy international businessman, moving fluidly between Cairo, London, and the financial capitals of Europe. He accumulated a personal fortune large enough to rival royalty, buying art, property, and influence across 2 continents, all while his true role as one of Mossad's most important sources remained one of the most tightly guarded secrets in Israeli intelligence history, hidden not just from Egypt, but from the vast majority of Mossad's own officers. For nearly 3 decades, almost no one outside a very small, need-to-know circle understood that the son-in-law of Gamal Abdel Nasser had ever set foot inside an Israeli embassy, let alone become one of its most valuable assets. The secret held for almost 30 years, until 2002, when an Israeli historian published detailed research identifying Ashraf Marwan as Mossad's single most important Egyptian source of the entire Yom Kippur War era. The revelation detonated across the Middle East almost overnight. In Egypt, it was treated as an act of national betrayal at the very highest possible level. The trusted son-in-law of the revolution's founding father quietly unmasked as an agent of the enemy state. Marwan himself denied everything, publicly and forcefully, in interview after interview, right up until the day he died. But by then, the denial could no longer undo what had already been written into the permanent historical record by researchers on both sides of the border. Inside Israel, the exposure triggered its own bitter reckoning. Former generals who had blamed the intelligence failures of 1973 on faulty analysis now found themselves publicly blamed in return, accused of ignoring or mishandling the clearest warning any spy had ever given them. Old rivalries between retired officers resurfaced in the press, each side using Marwan's story to defend their own version of what had gone wrong on the eve of that war. The man who had once operated in total secrecy became, almost overnight, the central figure in one of the most public intelligence controversies in Israeli history. On June the 27th, 2007, Ashraf Marwan was found dead on the pavement outside his luxury London apartment. He had fallen, or been pushed, or perhaps jumped, from the balcony of his 5th-floor flat. British police investigated for months and ultimately ruled the death unexplained. No one was ever charged. No definitive answer was ever officially reached, and none has emerged in the years since. Was it Egyptian intelligence finally settling a decades-old act of betrayal now that it had been publicly confirmed? Was it Mossad silencing a source who had suddenly become a serious liability the moment his identity became public knowledge? Or was it, as some who knew him insist, simply a private and unrelated tragedy with no espionage attached to it at all? To this day, the file remains one of the most debated unsolved deaths in the modern history of global espionage. In the days before his death, associates say Marwan had grown increasingly anxious, aware that a British legal dispute over the very book that had exposed him was about to force even more details of his double life into open court. Whether that anxiety was the private fear of a man about to be fully unmasked, or the very real fear of a man who believed his life was now in genuine danger, remains, like almost everything else about him, entirely a matter of interpretation. What happened next only deepened the mystery surrounding Ashraf Marwan's entire life. Egypt gave him a funeral befitting a national hero. Full military honors, senior government officials in attendance, extensive state television coverage broadcast across the country. For a man that Israeli researchers had just publicly named as one of the most important spies ever run against Egypt, that response made almost no logical sense at all. Unless the funeral itself was understood as the final, deliberate move in a much longer and far more complicated game. If Marwan truly had betrayed Egypt for over 3 decades, feeding its most sensitive secrets to an enemy state, why would Cairo choose to honor him this way, in full public view of the world? Some analysts believe it was simply about saving face. Egypt refusing to let the world witness just how deeply Israeli intelligence had once penetrated the very center of its presidential family. Others believe it was the last and most convincing piece of evidence for an entirely different theory: that Ashraf Marwan was never truly Israel's man at all, that he had, in fact, been Egypt's man inside Mossad the whole time, patiently feeding just enough real intelligence over the years to purchase total trust, so that the one lie that mattered most, the exact timing of a war, would be believed by Israel without a single moment's hesitation. More than 15 years after his death, intelligence historians in Israel, in Egypt, and around the world still cannot fully agree on who Ashraf Marwan really was. A patriot who paid the ultimate price for helping Israel survive its darkest week. A traitor who sold his own country's blood for money and status. Or something rarer and far more dangerous than either. A man so skilled at deception that he made 2 of the world's most sophisticated intelligence services each believe for decades that he belonged entirely and only to them. Perhaps that lingering uncertainty is the truest measure of exactly how good he really was. Because the greatest double agents in history are rarely remembered for the secrets they revealed. They are remembered instead for the one question they never let anyone answer for certain, even after their own death. Whose side were they really on all along? Where every conflict has a cause, every border has a cost, and every war leaves something behind.